Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California, the Speaker of the House of Representatives is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him for his leadership, Mr. Chairman Gregory Meeks, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, for his leadership in bringing this important issue of legislation to the floor, which addresses an issue of faith, of values, and of our country. The House comes together, hopefully in a spirit of unity, I would have hoped, and patriotism to condemn and combat Islamophobia and all forms of racism, prejudice, and discrimination. Listening to the debate, I heard Mr. Danny Davis earlier as he was singing Don't Mess with Mr. in between, talking about religion and talking about how it should be off limits. People's religion should be respected. I know, and probably it is true of everyone here, the respect we have for our own faith, our own religion, enables us to appreciate the faith, the respect people have for their faith. That's why this is so sad, because it's an attack on the faith of one of our members. Sadly but clearly, Islamophobia is a sinister, growing, and for too many American Muslims, a constant presence in our nation. To just review some of the figures, nearly 70% of American Muslims have personally experienced anti-Muslim discrimination since September 11th. Thousands of documented acts of anti-Muslim bigotry and violence are recorded each year, with many thousands unreported. Attacks are growing more common and more brazen, from vandalism on mosques to physical assaults on women wearing hijabs to hate speech, and from public officials to bullying and violence of children at school. Think of how the children hear this. And as we all know, the bigotry is targeted at one of our own, shamefully from within this congressional community. Racism and bigotry of any form, including Islamophobia, must always be called out and condemned in any place it is found. This is particularly true in the halls of Congress, which are the very heart of our democracy, and where we have a responsibility under the rules of the House to behave in a way that brings dignity to this body. Our first president, George Washington, there he is looking over us. Over 230 years ago, in a letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, George Washington wrote, "Happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under the protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving in on all occasion their effectual support." He himself defining what is the right way to live. Indeed, bigotry and persecution have always been un-American, as demonstrated by our patriarch, George Washington. Anti-Muslim bigotry affects not only members, but many other members of our congressional community. As hundreds of Muslim staffers wrote last week, Mr. Speaker, they wrote this letter. They said, quote, "Hateful rhetoric by public officials directly impacts us and puts our safety at risk, both at the workplace and in our everyday lives." They further went on to say, the Muslim staffers whom we value here, "We must now come to work every day knowing that the same members and staff who perpetuate Islamophobic tropes and insinuate that we are terrorists also walk by us in the halls of Congress." It's really frightening. Disturbingly, Islamophobia is not a unique American experience, but a global scourge, and as other members have indicated, it's global. Earlier this year, the UN Human Rights Council declared that discrimination against Muslims has risen to epidemic proportions. Around the world, we see tragedy and tragic consequences of anti-Muslim attitudes. The genocide against the Uyghur people and other Muslim minorities in China. Atrocities committed against the Rohingya in Burma. attacks on Muslim refugees in Central Europe, and white supremacist violence against Muslims in New Zealand and Canada, targeting of Muslim minority communities in Western Asia and the Middle East. We must confront Islamophobia on any form of racism wherever it is found around the world, in our country, or even in these very halls. This legislation will not only address the rise in incidents of Islamophobia worldwide, but launch a plan to combat this bigotry. Thank you, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, for your leadership in advancing equity, justice, and dignity in our Congress, in America, and the world on this action. Thank you also to the Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman, Gregory Meeks, Mr. Chairman, for your support of this important action. With this bill's passage, Mr. Speaker, a special envoy for monitoring and combating Islamophobia will be created, just as the State Department has special envoys on anti-Semitism and international religious freedom. That is something we have always shared in this body, across the aisle and across the Capitol, in a bipartisan way, support for and respect for religious freedom at home and internationally. This envoy, the special envoy created here, will be charged with establishing a comprehensive strategy to combat Islamophobia worldwide. The State Department annual human rights reports will be expanded to include state-sponsored Islamophobic violence and impunity. As a nation that prides itself in the defense of human rights and dignity, we must be leaders both on the global stage and at home by example to combat violence against Muslims. Again, Islamophobia in any place is offensive, dangerous, and must be condemned. And Islamophobia in our own congressional community, specifically the repeating, ongoing, and target Islamophobic comments and actions against another member, as we witnessed this past year, is appalling and totally unacceptable. That language and behavior are far beneath the dignity of integrity, dignity, and decency with which the Constitution and our constituents require that we act in this House. These actions must be called out and not tolerated. Mr. Speaker, every day that we're in session, we begin with a prayer, because we believe in our own way. Some don't believe, but by and large, most people here believe. We do so with reverence for our own religious beliefs, with respect for the beliefs of others. If we didn't have such strong beliefs in ourselves and our own religion, it would be easy to believe where somebody might be frivolous about respecting someone else's devotion. But we do. We all profess to be people of faith. The House will continue to look into an array of options to address this priority and take real action to combat Islamophobia, as we have many times taken action to condemn anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to the makers of this motion, Congresswoman Schakowsky, who was very much a part of this, and Congresswoman Omar. I yield back the balance of my time and urge a strong bipartisan vote on this important legislation.
Gentleman.